working
Yes.
and people can see them. Okay,
Yes.
thank you, Sam and team, for arranging this event, and it's a privilege to be able to contribute again on this particular topic area. I'm beaming in from the lands of the Kulin people in Melbourne, Australia, and what I'd like to do in the session today is give you a flavour of some of the recent work on climate change education, which is going on internationally, zooming out and zooming into a number of different areas. On my first slide, in the bottom right-hand corner, there is a QR code where you can download my slides to follow along, because there is a lot of information. I will also just turn on the closed captioning, so hopefully you can see me speak if my accent isn't so clear. So we have a lot to get through, and I will proceed quickly. Just as a reminder, in the abstract for this particular presentation, I'm going to be focusing on some of the challenges and progress that has been made on Convention Article 6 of the Climate Summit work, COP meeting type stuff, the Paris Agreement, which looks at the role of education in advancing solutions towards climate challenges. And I'm also going to try and discuss some of the more recent aspects of that in relation to the Glasgow work programme. So just as a reminder, what I want to talk about is climate change as one of those challenges for the critical dialogues. And just using a UN definition there to remind us, this is about long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. I want to give you a flavour of some of the background to the work on action for climate empowerment in climate change education, some of the factors which will delay or drive some of the work in that space, but also to think about some of the direct and indirect challenges and where we might go to. So doing nothing about it, doing more, doing less, or doing different things. So just as we get going on this, as a reminder, I'm orienting this work on some of the aspects of contributions from my fellow colleagues at Monash University who contribute to things like the IPCC reports. And as we know from some of the recent editions of that, that climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health, and there is an emphasis on a rapidly closing window of opportunity. If we go back about 10 years or so, we know from this work on engaging with climate change that one of the key things we need to be clear about is technical solutions offer a necessary but an insufficient way forward. And as in this quote from Chris Rapley in the foreword to this incredible book on the kind of psychoanalytical and psychological aspects of climate change engagement, we also need to think about collectivism and interventions which move our attention away from the economics of growth, but more to thinking about confronting the problem. And that might include things like understanding the human tendency to self-delusion, but also some of the challenges which we have with denial and a lack of action. So again, in these kinds of slides here and in the book as a whole, there is an emphasis there on thinking about what we know about ourselves, what we know about others, and what it means to work together on a common challenge. So I would encourage you to have a look at that book if you are interested in following up on that. Now, how that relates to education is an interesting one, and I hope to explore and provoke some discussion around that in this particular presentation. If you're familiar with the work on action for climate empowerment, you'll know that these are some of the key goals, agreements, articles, etc., which link to that work. And again, we can see in these extracts from some of those documents, if we'd have a look inside the covers, there are emphases on things like developing and implementing educational and public awareness programs, giving public access to information, but also thinking about these different dimensions to the work of Action for Climate Empowerment, showing that it's linked to training, public awareness, international cooperation, and so on. And again, I just want to re-emphasize that point at the beginning about changing habits in the long term is seen as the goal of education in this space, leading to those three areas in the green box about fostering better understanding, promoting community engagement, and so on. What is clear from just a simple look at this is that's not just what schools do. And we can't expect the curriculum alone to do that kind of work, to change habits in the long term. We know how hard it is to change habits in the short term, and let alone to expect schools and teachers to be doing that kind of heavy lifting in this space. So what I want to kind of add to the mix at the moment is, again, this emphasis on the evolution of approaches, which have happened over the last 10 or 15 years, particularly in the run-up and after the Paris Agreement. Many of us will be familiar with what we might loosely call climate education, focus on the sciences, and what we might call climate literacy 1.0, but also with the work that the UN has done on climate change, capacity building, and the ACE documents, a focus on social change with climate change education. And Greta may not be as well known these days. She's campaigning on other issues at the moment, but the kind of climate emergency education versions of climate education which are out there. Again, there are some questions on the side there which you might want to consider in responding to my presentation there, but also there are other forms of education which have emerged: climate justice education, climate resilience education. And perhaps if you look to the moves in the US at the moment with the closing of the federal departments and ministries working in this space, actually probably what we might call climate denial education, as if there isn't a problem. Again, going back to that engaging with climate change education, perhaps we're in that worst case scenario with disavowal and denial that there is actually an issue and that we don't need to take any action. So again, if we think of the SDGs at the moment, the Sustainable Development Goals, we know that in 4.7 there is an attempt to link with 13.3, and UNESCO and UNFCCC have put efforts into that kind of space. And here's just an extract from one of their documents. And again, if we look at the work of people like Martha Monroe and colleagues, they've reviewed the literature on things like what counts as effective strategies. Again, I'm not going to go through all of this, but most of these are probably obvious to many of you in the audience, that increasing climate knowledge, deliberation, problem solving, having strategies which are embedded in local places and so on would make a lot of sense here to moving this area forward. So again, these colleagues from the University of Florida, again, have had a lot of their work squashed by the changes in the US administration recently. But again, they have emphasized that there's work to be done within schools and beyond schools to begin to address this work. Again, if we look at some more recent examples of this, again, if you went to Maria's presentation, her keynote, she's done a lot of work on climate emotions. The National Environmental Education Foundation in the US, NEF, has been developing toolkits which emphasize particular climate emotions. These might be what Israel Scheffer years ago would have called the cognitive emotions, so emphasizing the links between the affective and the cognitive, things like being empowered, inspired, showing empathy and gratitude, not just solely feelings, but how we educate our feelings and perhaps change our feelings about some of these things. And again, if you look at some of the resources available to this, I'd encourage you to go onto YouTube and watch this climate change rap video to see how that discusses this kind of work. Again, there is a transcript of some of this on the side here. And again, if you download the slides, these should be clickable and will take you to the websites. So to bring this up to date with some of the more recent work, again, the Glasgow programme was to move on from the Doha programme of work on embedding climate empowerment work into a number of different systems. And again, you can see here with things like the Greening Education Partnership and its emphasis, there are particular attempts and reports which advocate for a particular approach. But as some of the commentators at the Bonn meetings, which happened kind of mid-year, have just happened recently in Bonn for the latest special meeting there. This is from the 2024 one. Some of the arguments which are being raised and the observations which are being made there is that in theory, the Action for Climate Empowerment work is is sound, but in practice it's not being supported. So in terms of some of those barriers and challenges, I now want to look at some of the real world detail of what goes into this area. And as Deborah mentions here, one of the big challenges is limited financial support for ACE activities. They often struggle with minimal funding, and the structures which would be needed across local government, national government, in curriculum, in extracurricular spaces in formal and informal education aren't happening yet, but perhaps there are ways forward. So again, if we look at some of these calls to reconfigure climate change education, ACE and the like, some of these recent reports here have tried to push thinking about whether climate education can be included in the nationally determined contributions to carbon emission reduction. But again, there are some challenges with this, which perhaps I won't have time to go into today. But just to give you some examples of what this looks like in terms of real dollars, these are all figures in millions or thousands of US dollars. And just to emphasize, if you did a quick tally of the UNESCO's projects at the moment, just as an example, they have about $500 million worth of ongoing projects for the 2022-2025 framework. But when you actually dig into those and see where's the environmental education, the climate education, and climate related type activities, you will see it is a drop in the ocean. It is hardly anything in comparison to what is currently being funded through UNESCO. Again, if we are thinking that we need $1 trillion worth of climate finance, why hasn't the argument been made to heavily invest in education yet and to provide the funding to leverage what education can do? In the next couple of slides, I'll just give some illustrations. So here's one. This is specifically on ESD. Unsurprisingly, as a lot of ESD work is funded by the Japanese government, it is mainly focused on that kind of work. Again, here's another one, putting into practice ESD for 2030. This is a budget of 611,000, and this comes from the UNFCCC. And again, this is closely linked to that. It isn't very imaginative. It's not very new. It is not the thing which is going to turn around the education system. Again, here's another one. It happened while the Glasgow negotiations were going on, but this is not the scale of funding that will transform education. If you just divide 325,000 by just the typical populations in a country, people who go to schools, it is tiny. Now, what we are beginning to see is some new work, which is beginning to shift the financial dials and balance sheets on this. And here's one example. But the point to be made here is that people are already calculating what might be needed. And this is a report supported by the World Bank, which begins to work out what the numbers might be. Again, that highlighted bit there, 1.5% of climate finance went into the education sector in 2021. It clearly needs to be a lot more. So if we begin to look at some of the numbers, we can see in some of the highlights from that document, 65% of youth from low and middle income countries understand that their future depends on things like green skill jobs. And again, if we can fund education beyond just basic education, primary and secondary, we can begin to see some changes there. Again, some people have run the numbers. They reckon that approximately $18 US dollars is needed to make schools climate resilient. That isn't very much. If you think of what billionaires around the world spend their money on, they could easily fund this. There's philanthropic funding which could happen if governments don't want to fund this. It doesn't actually cost too much to do this kind of work. So again, it's really pleasing just to finish this section by thinking about some of the projects that the World Bank has done through its global partnership in education. This is more the kind of scale of investment that's needed. But again, this is a drop in the ocean with national budgets in education, whether that's in the school sector and beyond. So there are clearly challenges ahead with that. Again, if we think about some of the arguments for integrating ACE into the NDCs, there are attempts to do this. And again, these are just some extracts from some of the documents which illustrate those points. I'll just zoom in on the examples of targets. One of the challenges here is that the indicators don't seem fit for purpose. There's a huge emphasis in a lot of the work that whole school approaches are really important. So why we still don't have an indicator which looks at participation in whole school and whole of society approaches is staggering. It's now 2025. We should have had this at least 10 years ago, and certainly in the last 5 years, this was on the agenda. But also things like recommending climate modules for students in universities. It's easy to suggest this, but the reality is what you teach a doctor is not the same as what you teach a drama student. It's not what you'd teach a double degree student. So there clearly needs to be more thinking and development at that level. And again, what kinds of work do we need for teacher education? Is it the same content module, or should it actually be about educational techniques, pedagogies, curriculum, and so on? So there's work to be done here. Again, there's some reports emphasizing, like I've said, whole school approaches, but also what do schools model? And I think, again, that's where thinking about the role of schools as beacons, as employers, as where resource flows happen with what they purchase, what waste they produce, etc., can become a much more important part of thinking about climate resilient schools into the future and graduates from those schools. So again, if we move on to a quick summary of some of those things there, what we do need to see in the international debate to move this forward is recognition of the challenges of school change processes, thinking about whole school indicators, and also financial support, also for things like bottom-up quality initiatives. I worked originally in Europe, and things like the quality criteria for ESD schools as an important part of that, but also could help challenge some of the other directions which are happening in education around things like AI and the digital economy and infrastructure. We all know in the last 5 years, for example, the footprint of generative AI has grown massively. The Paris Agreement, the ACE guidelines, the Glasgow Work Programme didn't factor that in. So perhaps we also need to revise some of our strategies here. If we think about what's going on in Asia, for example, this report came out fairly recently. It emphasizes a couple of key things like a better alignment of climate ambitions with the things which are important in Asian contexts, and that includes things like climate finance, but also, if we move on to the next slide, things like transitions to greener energy and transport sectors. But also, again, we see this emphasis on a whole of society approach. So not seeing things like the SDGs as in silos, but again, if you are good at systems thinking, seeing the spillovers, the connections, the web of effects, some of which might actually push us backwards rather than always forwards, which again is what the Engaging with Climate Change book also talks about. So again, one of the things I would just like to give a shout out to all of those people who worked at NOAA, who have developed a lot of work in climate literacy over the years. Up there on their current website, they have pointed out that these are the kinds of figures, the costs of not taking action to adapt or mitigate. I would say that this is actually perhaps a question to ask about climate justice, and also who is going to pay. Those people who cannot insure their houses, those people who have lost lives because of flooding or extreme weather events. Again, financial literacy, political literacy, social literacy, economic literacy are all part of what a robust climate literacy might mean. And again, I'm from the UK originally. The word savvy, I think, is really important here. It's not just about being literate, but it's also about being shrewd, clever, focusing on what really matters, not just accumulating knowledge for the sake of accumulating knowledge, etc. So again, if we just quickly move to some considerations about what is climate literacy, again, this has now been archived in the US because of the Trump administration. But if you can still find this work, and it's important work, where it is emphasizing that a robust climate literacy needs to encompass some of these different aspects. And again, if we can get the funding to align with these aspirations and the systems in place which will make it more sustainable into the long run, then perhaps we'll be able to deliver on some of the aspirations for this as we go into the future. So again, the basics of climate literacy here, the reason I've picked this out is this is emphasizing it's not about individuals, but it's about a climate literate society. And again, I've made the point earlier on that a collectivist approach can sometimes be really important here. You don't just need a few experts or a few people in universities doing this work. This is about mass engagement, and figuring out how to do that through climate change communications can be really important. But also this recognition that Indigenous and local knowledges may be equally important too, and actually a much more culturally appropriate way of beginning to engage with diverse populations struggling with some of the effects, but also who might have solutions to some of the challenges presented here. So I'm nearly at the end of my presentation. I just want to wrap up with a couple of points here. This also is in the Climate Literacy Guide, and I do like this point here that you don't have to be just climate education mode. It might actually be about the social dimensions, the community competencies, the ability to design and implement solutions, which is a shift in what we should be focusing on. So again, that's what perhaps the 4.7.3 indicator should really be doing, not just listing content, but looking at how climate change words are verbed, how they are put into activities, what kinds of things matter there, not just listing content as, for example, a curriculum audit might do. What we actually need to know is what are the learning outcomes intended from engaging with this kind of work. So again, understanding the different causes, the different interpretations, understanding risk reduction strategies. A lot of my Indonesian PhD students do some fantastic work in disaster risk reduction. We did a recent symposium on the Sendai Framework Plus 10, and you can imagine there that linking climate and disaster risk reduction education could be a really important part of this, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. So again, a couple more slides just to wrap up here. This kind of public access to information is part of ACE. In effect, the effect of the Trump administration removing this means that it is breaking some of the recommendations, the guidelines from ACE, and that needs to be called out and that needs to be addressed. It does not mean having shadow sites at a federal level. It means having mainstream sites to inform all citizens, no matter which state they're in or which way their governors vote, that they can have access to robust information about what is going on, but also being able to deal with disinformation and misinformation. Again, with the this is my attempt at a joke. If you've ever seen the Jaws film, this is now 50 years old. We're going to need a bigger boat. Perhaps we're going to need a bigger Noah in this if we are going to achieve this. These are just some of the figures of the influence that some of these climate literacy websites can have. So again, making sure that country by country, state by state, locally as well as internationally, we have access to information. So just to summarize, some of the things which I think in terms of my third and fourth point that we need to consider. Again, the ACE guidelines are non-binding. They lack enforceability. Peer pressure to make changes hasn't worked. The timelines are weak, and they're often misaligned with expectations and realities in schooling. To focus on, say, what goes on in year 3, year 6, and year 9, that may be mandatory education, but in Australia, at the Australasian Science Education and Research Association last week, we were reminded there that in science education, for example, it's year 10 where you get your climate education. That is not picked up in the current guidelines and recommendations around that work. And again, if you do outdoor education, it might be in year 11. That has amazing whole school type approaches, integrated approaches, climate emotion approaches embedded in that kind of work, but it's not being recognized. So again, we do need to consider that kind of work there. But also, again, looking through there are other aspects that we need to see considered. If I just think of D there, there's been a lot of attention to gender violence programs recently. We all know that changing people's behaviours in that space over the long term requires a lot of investment. Climate change is, in theory, a super wicked problem. We need the investment in this space which does justice to that recognition, equally, if not more so than what we are doing for gender violence, important though that is. So again, thinking about where we might go with this space is going to be really important. So again, in my slides, I have a final set of recommendations around ways of enhancing work in this space, which list this, and there are some suggested readings and the QR code again, in case you want to download these slides and not listen to me talk so quickly through so much material. But thank you for your time. I think my 25 minutes are up, and I think we should be moving to some discussion and questions, Sam, if that's okay. Thank you, everybody.
Professor, could you hear me? I'm an audience member on site. Okay, nice to learn from your presentation, which is very informative and insightful. Your story make me think of a kind of political paradox that why we vote. We all know general election is very important and vote supposedly should be very important. But how could an individual vote change the world? I don't want to make this metaphor, but climate change to me, you talk about climate literacy. That's a very important story. But that share to me is shared a kind of similar situation that we all know climate change is very important, but how an individual make a change. The story which you share, of course, very important. But after graduation, when students have to work, have to face the reality, or have to make the living, it seems that we face the same paradox against. So I wish to perhaps, from your insight, how could we sustain this kind of climate literacy after graduation? Thank you very much, and sorry for my pessimistic question. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's an important question to ask. I think I'm always reminded of the pebble in your shoe. Something very small can be very irritating. So don't ever discount the effect that one vote can have, particularly in a democracy. I'm also reminded that a lot of the social movement for change, for example, whether it's on LGBT plus rights, as an example, what you really are working towards there for success is a 1 in 30 or a 3.5% take up of the idea to bring about social change. If it looks like you are aiming for 100%, we all know that that's not going to be achievable. We also know just from simple marketing strategies that if you divide people up into 3 groups, those who will get it, those who don't need to get it, and those who will never get it, there will be people like us, I suspect, who feel that this is really important. So we probably have adequate climate literacy at present. But there are also going to be people who will never want to engage with this, and targeting or trying to engage with them will probably be a waste of energy and time. It's the group in the middle who might help generate that 1 in 30, that 3.5%. Again, just as a very simple technique to think here, most classrooms around the world have something like 30 students in. If you are aiming to engage with someone who wants to take this work forward, at least one of them, they may be enough to start generating that social movement for change. Now, I know that might be quite a naive way of putting this, but it's actually what a lot of social movement research suggests, that you can begin to change the political climate. You can move what some people talk about as the Overton window in your direction, that kind of what is politically acceptable to talk about. And again, depending on your cultural context, that might be important. I've just been supervising some PhD students where we were talking about, if, for example, you're a fundamentalist Christian, perhaps you talk about creation care and your obligations to steward the planet. That might be way more important than having an argument with someone about what are the causes of climate change. So pick your battles, pick the conversations you need to have, but also, like with my second point here about democratic legitimacy, if people are losing their jobs because a green transition is not happening, again, there may be other arguments. And again, it might be in business and economics classes that climate change education needs to be happening, not in science education only, or in outdoor education or geography or biology. We might need to think differently about vocational and professional education and what is needed there in terms of training for people to have access to knowledge and to make informed decisions as citizens. So again, it's a long answer to a short question, but I think it's part of the reason I've mentioned why political literacy might be really important. Understanding how you make a difference in society, who has power, how to challenge power, how to redistribute power. All of those kinds of considerations are really important for seeing climate change education move beyond questions of content. Sam, just to confirm, we can't hear you from your microphone.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah.
Can you? Yep, perfect. Oh, sorry. Technical. Yeah, thank you again, Alan, for your wonderful sharing. And in view of the time, let us move on to the next speaker. Let us continue the dialogue right after the symposium via email or other form of communication. So next, we have the honor to have invited Dr. Sally Birdsall from Faculty of Arts and Education, Curriculum and Pedagogy from University of Auckland, New Zealand. And Sally lectures in science and sustainability education at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Her research focuses on teaching and learning about socio-ecological challenges, such as climate change and holding biodiversity laws. Now, let me pass the time to Sally. Thank you again, Sally.
Thank you very much, Sam. Kia ora koutou, and welcome from New Zealand. I'm from Auckland, and thank you to all of the organisers for inviting me to present some research that I've recently done with Associate Professor Chris Eames. So this particular research is looking at hope and exploring the relationship between three really important things in climate education: knowledge about climate change, how can we help students have hope for the future, and how can we help them develop agency? So next. So our starting point is the challenges that the world's facing, and also that the next generation are going to be those that are most affected by climate change. And it's not just physically, it's also emotionally and financially. And so it becomes our moral imperative to help youth prepare and manage their lives and have these strategies to be able to cope with this changed world. And we know that more than knowledge is needed. So they need hope for the future, because hope can give them agency to act. So the research question that guided our particular project was looking at a hopeful climate change education program that would foster hope and develop agency in secondary school students. So this is what we did. We had research partners. So first of all, we developed an intervention, which was a climate change learning program with 2 teachers in 2 different schools. There were 2 classes. There was one year 10 class, which are 14 to 15-year-old students, and a year 11 and 12 class, which were 17 to 18-year-old students. And we also had an environmental psychology expert work with us. And the sequence of our research was, first of all, we gathered some data before the program started, and then we carried out this intervention using our climate change learning program. And then during the program and after the program, we also gathered some more data about students' perceptions. What was the underpinning of our program was this idea of a critical realist lens. And critical realism looks at the interplay with structures and the development of agency in our project. And structures can be seen as a macro level structure, which is looking at things like the climate science, the IPCC reports. It's also looking at mesostructure, and these are structures that we find at community level, at a city level, and it could be looking at, a community garden being developed or the riparian planting of a local stream. And then there's micro level structures, and these are things that happen at an individual level. Things like looking at your household energy usage, maybe looking at the way that you as a family transport yourself around during your everyday life. And agency is seen as taking action on these structures. So this is what we were looking at, is how could agentic and hopeful teaching help students identify and act upon structures so that they could create a more climate-friendly world for themselves. So our climate change learning program went for 10 weeks, and there was about 4 hours of class time each week. And once again, referring to Martha Munro's work, we incorporated the research-based strategies to build knowledge and agency and to nurture feelings of hope. And Alan's already referred to Martha's systematic review they did of the types of strategies that help students' climate change education. So in the first phase of our program, there was exploration of climate science. So this is the knowledge, and also Indigenous knowledge. And we had climate scientists come in and talk to these students. The second phase was looking at hope and agency, and the environmental psychologists came in and talked to the students about that, about emotions and hope. And there was also presentations about societal structures and action taking. And then what happened in the third stage was the students brought all their learning together to actually take action on identified structures. So in order to gather data about the students, we had a pre and post-program survey which explored their perceptions of the knowledge, hope and agency they were feeling. And we also had this perceptions barometer and also reflections where at various points throughout the program, we asked them to think about, how hopeful were they feeling about the future, or how agentic they were feeling. And then at the end, there were focus group interviews with the students where they reflected on their experiences. And we also gathered some data from the teachers themselves, asking them about how efficacious they felt and how engaged their students were feeling, and also their own personal reflections about the students' learning and their own teaching. So it was quite a lot of data that we managed to gather. So what I've got here is the barometer findings from the 14 to 15-year-olds. And you can see that here are 5 data points. So at this point here, this was their perceptions of how they felt that they understood about climate change. And you can see with the 14 to 15-year-olds, there was a gradual growth in their perceptions of their understanding about climate change. The green is their feelings of agency, how they feel they could take action to make differences. And you can see once again, the 14 to 15-year-olds, their feelings of agency grew over the course of the program, as did their feelings about hopefulness for the future. So these 14 to 15-year-olds, it was, a wonderful story about success. Now, the 16 to 18-year-olds were a different group. So like the younger group of students, you can see their perceptions about their knowledge about climate change grew over the 10 weeks. Their feelings about their agency stayed pretty much the same, as did their feelings of hopefulness about the future, with a slight blip here. So the 16 to 18-year-olds, it didn't seem to be quite as successful. And I think this really did give us this understanding of the complexity we face when we go into a classroom and try and help students understand about climate change and try and nurture their hope and agency. So in terms of the barometer theme of understanding, you can see, as I've already pointed out, the 14 to 15-year-olds, there was this steady upward trend. The 18-year-olds, there was this rise at B2, barometer level 2, and then it stayed high throughout the rest of the program. And both groups attributed their growth and understanding to the learning they had during the program. And you can see here a quote from one of the students saying, they had this opportunity to learn a lot more and develop their deeper understanding. And the students did recognize the significance of the topic and the need for change. And you can see the students here talking about finding ways to decrease human activity. In terms of agency, School A, these are the younger students. There was this clear upward trend. They definitely felt more agentic as the program went on. And they identified 2 types of agency. You'll like this, Alan. There's the collective agency. They did talk about that. And there were these themes that ran through their program, their responses. They talked about being ill-equipped. They didn't have the skills to act. And this theme was most prevalent at the start. And then, of course, as the barometer showed, it fell away at B5. And here's the student here at the beginning, at barometer point 1, talking about they didn't think they had the skills to act. My voice wouldn't be heard right now. But as their feelings of agency rose, they made comments like they now know what to do. They knew that they should bike instead of drive. They should use less power and cut down on waste. And then they recognized that they could be agentic together. And here we are, the students talking about if we all work together, we can get people on board to stop climate change. The older students, there was a very small upward trend. And what was interesting was here, the credentialing exams that these students have to do to be able to get into tertiary education started to make a difference. So instead of seeing themselves as agentic acting on structures, what they interpreted agency was being able to choose the type of action that they could carry out for their national credentialing exam. And they had a strong focus on individual agency. Once again, there was this theme they felt ill-equipped. And here's a student at the very end talking about the action that they took for their examination. They said they didn't think that one person being a vegan was really going to help. This was quite a popular choice for action taking. Feeling agentic was more frequent, and here's a student saying, well, I could change my ways more easily to be more sustainable. You've just got to do it. And these students thought more about the big picture, about social change processes, talking about the way that everyone needs to contribute and commit. And it can start with one person. You've actually got to change the way the world works and functions. It has to involve whole nations and societies. I can see you smiling, Alan. So interesting comments from these older students. In terms of hope, the younger students, the hope ratings rose. You can see from 3.61, that was the average, to 4.4. The high point was 6. And their comments looked outward and related to other people. So they talked about being collectively agentic as a form of being hopeful. So if we all chip in, we can save Earth. And this idea of responsibility. And they were talking about the way that people in power need to do something, because if they don't, all the protests and doing our bit won't do anything at all. And there was evidence of climate anxiety. Here's students talking about they just want to be alive in 50 years and worrying about future generations and being scared of what the world could end up like in 2020 and 2050. The older students, there was less movement. It did peak, but then fell back again. There was more distress at present in their responses and more nuanced theory and blaming. So these students felt they had no agency. They thought, they said they knew there were things that could be done, but they're not being done, and there's nothing I can do at my age to help. And they blamed other people and decision makers. They talked about the world leaders being messed up. They talked about most corporations, which had the most impact on climate, not doing anything. And then climate anxiety. Here's a student saying learning more, so here's knowing more about it means I'm learning how badly the world is doing and how difficult it's going to be to improve things. And his students saying, I've got little hope that the world's going to survive climate change. And this is at 0.4 of 5. So this was near the end of the program. However, these students did identify sources of hope. They talked about engaged and capable people. So because they felt people could be adaptable, and they are trying to fix things now through the use of electric cars, that there was hope. And that people had these positive human qualities. There's definitely people who can address the problem. And they found the class content inspiring. For example, the older students, I took them to a community city farm where they saw how permaculture can help reduce climate impacts, and it made them feel more hopeful. And also learning about what's being done to stop climate change. And then fellow activists, so role models, helped make a difference. They talked about the school strike for climate people and the Extinction Rebellion movement, giving them hope that things might change for the better. Then what we did was we looked at the link or possible link between knowledge and agency, and there were comments that suggested that knowledge precedes agency and more impactful action. And here's a student talking about the way that small things that they do can influence their carbon footprint and how they actually relate to the climate. So they're able to make that connection as to what they were doing was making a difference. And here's a student talking about the more I can do, the more I know, the more they can do to impact on climate change, which does point to the importance of knowing about climate science. And then there were also comments that suggested this link between agency and hope. So here's students talking about action projects building feelings of agency, which associated with increased feelings of hope. So here at School A, the students were working on solutions. They'll be able to educate more students at our school about the importance. And here's a student saying, I can do little things that will make a change. And here's a student at School B, the older student, talking about their action had a significant impact on their household. but it's very complex. And in the focus group interviews, students started talking about the way that climate change wasn't their fault, that it was adults who were the ones who should be driving change. They have the income to buy the stuff, and students don't. They don't have control to do that. And then talking about the way that current adults, our generation, thinking that because it's not going to affect them in their lifetime, they don't have to care, we're not going to be around to have to live with the consequences. And if they're not to contribute, students thought that they've got to get adults to help them to actually make a difference. So they're pointing to this idea that, it's not just about educating the children and the students in school, it's also adults in society. So there's a lot of informal education about what adults should be doing. And once again, this idea that adults don't think it's their responsibility, it's not going to affect them in the future. They feel that because other people aren't doing anything, what's the point of me making a change? And here's a snippet of one of the students talking about the way about burning wood in a wood burner. This is so if you burn wood, you're going to release carbon into the atmosphere. And the student saying, well, their sister said it's only a small fire, but then the student said, but yet if it was only us doing it, it wouldn't make much of a difference, but everybody's doing it. So if everybody has a small fire, it makes a big fire. So here's students actually thinking about systems and thinking about how action at their micro level can actually have a difference at the meso level. And then these students here, this is a direct quote from a focus group interview, they were talking about transport, and they were talking about bus fares needing to be cheap, and talking about the way that because they were too far away from the bus stop, they couldn't take the bus. They weren't, because they were too close to the school. But if you had more buses, there'd be less cars on the road. And they learnt, and they'd studied about public transport and found that a bus produced far less carbon monoxide, far less pollution than people in a car. So they thought it was more relevant to be on the bus. But then the student talking about the way that they had to drive to the bus stop, and that was made a difference to the carbon emissions they made. And then talking about parents. So if they go to work, it's hard to see whether that you should take a space on the bus or get your parents to give you a ride. And the reason why I've got this slide here is because it's showing how these students are developing this this understanding of the complexity that we face when we start to make decisions about how to reduce carbon emissions. And these last couple of slides just talk about the teachers, well, not just talk about the teachers. So here's the teacher at school A. Now, she was a science teacher, and she thought climate education was really important. She thought that if a student goes all the way through their education and they haven't been taught about climate education, they should be angry. It's a disservice to them. And she talked about the way the school should support climate change education. And she thought that if nothing's been done in the school, and in the practices that the school enacts, and she says here, if it's got an indirect link to climate change, they'll think, well, if the school doesn't care about it, why should she? Why should we? This idea that schools should be models of how you can take action to mitigate climate change. And she thought that the students were highly engaged in their projects, and they felt like they actually knew something. They feel that they've got authority, that they themselves have enough authority they can tell someone else and feel confident that they were telling them the right thing. So she thought that was really important. The teacher at school B had a chemistry background, and he was actually disappointed that his students weren't more interested in the science of climate change, because he thought it was really interesting. And he talked about they weren't interested in the science, they didn't want to engage with it, which once again makes us think about how much knowledge should we be teaching our students about climate change. And then he realized the students wanted more than just the science-focused approach. They wanted to know about the agency. And he talked about the way that it hadn't been dominant in his teaching before because he just sort of focused on the chemistry. And he lamented about the way that he was teaching to the exams and not perhaps addressing what these students actually wanted to learn about. And he was hoping that with the systems level thinking and the examples we showed them, that the students develop feelings of agency so their actions would make a difference to their behaviour and have some impact on a climate disruptive future. So in terms of our teaching, what we learnt was that yes, students did want to learn about climate change, but perhaps not too much. And they can learn about these structures in all levels of society and start identifying who are the players and who are the actors and what levers can they start pulling to start making a difference. And they did come to realize about the possibilities for agency. And this is something we need to think about in our teaching is with which players or actors can you collaborate and bring into your classroom program to help students learn about what they can do to make a difference? You know, how can you what can they pull and how? But this idea of hope, it's so fragile and it can be nurtured through knowing about climate change and societal structures and how to be agentic. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm interested in any questions.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sally, for your wonderful sharing, and in particular, focusing on climate change education. So you mentioned climate science, teaching climate science that should not be too much regarding the cause and the consequence. So we've been thinking, in Hong Kong, we've been thinking about how much should we give to the student or to the younger generation in terms of the knowledge, how deep the knowledge that we should deliver to them in the first place, and secondly, what's the best duration of the program that we offer to them. So normally for now, we're offering maybe four times in a span of 4 weeks. So once a week, so we deliver environmental education program to the younger generation. And for your case, you mentioned it would be a 10 weeks program. So we've been thinking what's the dosage that would initiate the impact?
I think that's a really difficult question. And I think that it was a one-off program, and this is a definite limitation. I can't help wondering, and I would like to explore what would happen if you integrated climate change into a program in authentic ways throughout every year of education. And you know, how much difference could you make to students' feelings of hope and their feelings of agency? And if you didn't just do it once, you know, like you talk about a 4-week program, and I think this goes back to environmental education not just being, you know, oh, we've done it now, we've done our 4 weeks of environmental education, we're moving on to something else. What would it be like if we could infuse it across all levels in an appropriate way and in a way that was authentic to students? So it's I think it's going back to what Alan was talking about, is how could we do it in a way that every student got the opportunity to engage with it at all levels throughout their education, throughout their year in an appropriate way. Because, you know, you couldn't do it all the time, but how could you bring it in at each level?
Yeah. In fact, it's quite a big challenge for Hong Kong, and especially for the high school. The curriculum is already very packed, and we actually discussed the idea of delivering climate change education to the school with the principal and teacher. The key concern was the time required, and so we will see. Thank you so much, Sally. So just to see if there are any questions from Zoom or from our speaker.
I was just going to point out that Alan talked about a whole school approach, and I think it definitely goes back to that. You can't just do a 4-week program, now we've done it and move on. It's got to almost be constantly addressed, when appropriate.
Yeah, I think it would be nice to do it every year, continuously. Yeah, Alan.
I completely agree, Sally, and I thought your presentation was spot on and reinforced a lot of what I'd been raising too. But that kind of thing about an overcrowded curriculum, again, at the ERA conference last week, Dick Gunston's raised, what do you remove from the curriculum when you keep trying to add more stuff in?
Yeah.
We cannot simply just add more and more in. So just rethinking, what should the curriculum be for? Who decides? And again, if it's adding more issues in, something has to be taken out. Now, there are some other thoughts around what a curriculum should be and who should determine that. But curriculum vitae, your whole life's curriculum, would suggest that just focusing on what would typically be the 14,000 hours someone experiences in school, that is not the 4,000 weeks of a typical lifespan. So again, if we change how we think about lifelong learning, experience outside of schools, the role of social media, all of the different kinds of things where we get our information from. I think those are some of the things which Sally's point around, why do some people disconnect? Why do they feel there's nothing? They are being bombarded and overwhelmed by all sorts of information. And again, having critical media literacy, political literacy, working out what you want to do with your life, that's what school should really help students do, not just pass exams.
Yeah, and that really came into those older students. They were only interested in passing their exam. And it also constrained our program because we had to tailor it around that.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Sally and Alan. And so it's about time for us to move on. So we have our third speaker, Dr. Jessica Fisher from the University of Kent, UK. She will be sharing with us Conserving Biodiversity for Human Health and Wellbeing. Jessica is a conservation social scientist based at the Durrell Institute of Conservation Ecology, DICE, UK. Jessica's research is interdisciplinary, using mixed methods to tackle environmental challenges. Jessica, the time is yours. Thank you. Yeah, Jessica, could you unmute? Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, for that. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today, to Sam and everyone involved in the symposium, and yeah, great talks from Alan and Sally. So I'm Jess, I'm a research fellow from DICE in the University of Kent in the UK. And my talk today is going to be a little bit different. So we're talking today about biodiversity and why conservation of biodiversity is important for health and well-being. So we're facing a global extinction crisis alongside the climate crisis. So emphasizing the value of biodiversity for human health is something that can really resonate with people. So today I'm going to start by talking about health and well-being and what we mean by it. And I'll also be talking you through some of the evidence linking metrics of nature with well-being and comparing that with metrics of biodiversity. And I'll also be talking about how and why we see some of these relationships, thinking through some of the theories between those linkages. And then we'll be thinking about how that evidence can be used to improve health and well-being in practice, thinking about applications such as land use planning approaches or as part of a public health system. And finally, if we've got time, I'll be talking about some of my PhD work, which took place in Guyana in Northern South America. So what do we mean by health and well-being? I'm starting here with the ecosystem service concept. So this was sort of popularized in 2003, and it's developed a lot since then. It continues to be one of the best ways to connect with people and help them understand the importance of biodiversity. This diagram shows some of the ways that ecosystems benefit our health and well-being, thinking about food and nutrition, for example, pollination services. Biodiversity improves the quality of our water and of our air, purifies wetlands, for example. Ecosystems give us traditional medicines, such as from a diversity of plants. These spaces can also provide us with somewhere to exercise, socialize, to relax, can give us emotional or sort of intangible benefits that are a bit more difficult to measure. This stuff is really relatable for everyone. Every time I talk about my work with somebody, they throw an anecdote about, you know, their back garden or a walk they've been on and how it made them feel. And as we've just seen from Sally and Alan, the role of emotions and psychology are crucial for communicating important problems with people. And so together, these different kinds of framings are really, really great to communicate the importance of ecosystems to both policy and decision makers, but also to everyday people. What do we mean by health and well-being? I'm going to use these sort of two terms interchangeably, and I'll just explain why. So the World Health Organization actually defines health as well-being. They state that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease. So in other words, health isn't about just whether we're dying or whether we're ill, but it's also about how good we feel. And this idea that our health is multidimensional is reflected in this. So this is the biopsychosocial spiritual model of health that comes from integrative medicine. You can think of your health as a pizza. So you have your physical health, cardiovascular disease, inflammation, biomarkers, blood pressure. Your psychological health, maybe your mood, your emotion, cognition, concentration, fatigue. Social health, your relationships with other people, social cohesion, a sense of community. And finally, our spiritual health, so thinking about connecting with perhaps something greater, maybe meaning, inspiration, and ultimately all these slices are interconnected to make that whole sort of idea of health. So thinking about a bit of the evidence, how does nature benefit those different types of health? So many of you fondly remember your daily lockdown walks in local parks and gardens. They were all completely packed on sunny days. They were really important for those of us without gardens or balconies. If anyone uses Strava, you can actually access the exercise database on metrostrava.com. You can see after the dotted line, when lockdowns were imposed, exercise and green space increased significantly. So everyone was going out for physical health, but also to relax, to socialize, cognitive and social health. And COVID kind of really elevated that conversation about the importance and also the inequality and access to green spaces for our health and well-being. And this was one of the most this paper's cited quite a lot. So these researchers showed that just 2 hours spent in nature can significantly improve our health. They found improvements also in life satisfaction. And it didn't seem to matter whether that was 1 2-hour visit or several shorter visits within a week. So we can start thinking about maybe a dose or an optimum amount of time that might be beneficial to improving our health. So this was a study from the UK. And you don't even have to go outside. So views of greenery from your home can include roadside trees, parks or woodlands, led to people being significantly less lonely, less depressed and less anxious. This was a study, 3,000 people in Tokyo. And indeed, if you live in a greener residential area, we have an association with lower prescription rates for antidepressant medication. This is a study from Scotland, and it used census data in urban areas. And on the plot, there was actually only a slope for some social groups. So those with a higher proportion of ethnic minority groups. So there's something else going on here, and that's starting to show something called environmental health inequalities. And this inequality was shown sort of from this seminal study published in one of the world's best health journals. So they looked at exposure to green space of over 300,000 people across England. And I've edited the graph to make it a bit more obvious about what's happening here. So they showed that as you go from the least exposed to nature to the most exposed, the only people that saw significant declines in mortality and circulatory disease were those in the most deprived households. So the authors suggested that it might be a sort of buffer effect. So those in more deprived groups may have existing structural inequalities. They may be less likely to exercise or have pre-existing health conditions or other characteristics that led them to have worse health outcomes. And so exposure to nature for those groups helped protected them from the negative health effects of those factors most strongly. We're healthier, we're less lonely, we're less depressed, we're less anxious, and we've got a lower risk of death when we're exposed to nature. But from a conservation perspective, we know that green spaces can be super diverse. Can we get those health benefits we just saw from these very two different types of ecosystem? And we need that detail to inform policy and practice, our green space designs, our landscape plans, our planting regimes, and our conservation actions. So we need to know what makes these two spaces different. And so we'll be looking at biodiversity. So in ecology, we know this as the variety within species, between species, but also between ecosystems. And if we're thinking about those things, there's actually a lot that we don't know when it comes to nature and health. And what do we know about biodiversity specifically, as opposed to those metrics of green space or nature? Well, it seems that if we live in an area with a higher species richness of birds, we're more satisfied with our lives. This seems to be similarly important to the amount of income that we get, although you can see the error bars are quite huge. And the authors of this study figured that it might be because of the sort of multi-sensory experience of birds. So the sounds and the colours, but also the landscape properties that promote bird diversity, so water sources or trees, which are also beneficial to us in other ways. And it also seems that where you have a higher density of street trees within 100 metres of your house, got a significantly lower incidence of prescription rates for antidepressants again. So you're seeing that effect get steadily less important as the buffer gets wider. But did the chicken or the egg come first? So do healthier people and wealthier people just live in areas with more trees? So we have a look at some experimental evidence, taking it to the lab. So looking at whether physical and emotional responses to forests in a virtual reality setting. This was 30 people in VR headsets, showing that if you spend time in forests compared with urban areas as a control, you've got reduced fatigue, tension and depression, which is nice. So similarly, this is a kind of, this is in an aquarium setting. So these guys spoke to 100 people in an aquarium and they did a before and after the aquarium was being restocked. And they found that people preferred more diverse aquariums. They reported feeling better, more positive emotions, and also drops in blood pressure and heart rate from the baseline, indicating that more fish are more calming and more restorative. And finally, this kind of experimental study, so they showed that different combinations of meadow plants influence sort of different stress responses. So they found decreases in blood pressure were largest when respondents viewed a higher diversity of plant species. And that was up to a peak in relaxation, sort of around 32 species, after which that effect dropped off. But what's really interesting is that actually the highest drops in blood pressure were when they showed participants a monoculture of common poppies. So this tells us something perhaps about aesthetic preferences and emotional responses, maybe the color red, maybe something more meaningful or symbolic, but also about abundance of species when it comes to our health and our well-being. So we're more satisfied with our lives. We've got lower blood pressure, better mood. We're taking less antidepressants. But why is this happening? So scientists have been building different models to represent these complex relationships for a long time. This was one of the most recent. So in green, you have biodiversity and exposure to it. And then you can also see sort of in gray the different mechanisms. So reducing harm or restoring our attention. And then in blue, you've got the health and well-being outcomes, so different metrics of health and well-being as we've seen so far, so depression, mortality, life satisfaction, and stress, etc. And some of the theories explaining these mechanisms have been around for nearly 50 years. So one of the earliest was this idea of attention restoration. Biodiversity evokes all these emotions and feelings. People find it fascinating, it's awe-inspiring, gives us a sense of escape or like being away from our everyday worries. And places that offer these feelings more, have been called kind of restorative environments. And we now try to measure this sort of perceived restorativeness in people, or in other words, to what extent people have these experiences in different places. And it can also help us recover from stressful stimuli. So you might have an initial emotive reaction to biodiversity, could stimulate sort of reduced physiological activity, which is why we saw those drops in blood pressure and in heart rate as well. Some people believe that since we evolved around biodiversity, we're kind of innately programmed to respond positively to these environments. This theory has kind of received a lot of criticism. Another is that, some habitats maybe provide us with somewhere to hide, which could be another kind of evolutionary mechanism. But none of these theories are kind of specific to biodiversity, so there's a lot still to work on in this area. And importantly, of course, people's perceptions matter. And often people are completely incapable of recognizing what's around them. And so these guys, this was another seminal paper, and it showed that kind of people's perceptions of species richness, so the diversity of plants, birds, and butterflies, didn't actually relate at all to the actual diversity of these species that were present in ecological surveys. And it was only people's perceptions that were beneficial to their health and well-being, rather than what was actually there. So thinking about how our perceptions matter, of course, our personal experiences of biodiversity are also multisensory. So I'm going to talk here about one of the postdocs I've just finished. I was working with Professor Zoe Davies, who led a European Research Council grant to explore this. So part of it involves sending 200 people into these 2 woodlands in England. And we asked them, what did you notice and how did it make you feel? And they would encounter, say, this woodpecker or this blue tit, and they'd have these kind of big emotional reactions to, flashes of color, red and white, or they'd talk about, flocking behaviors, like lifting their spirits. And we spent many weeks coding 140 hours of focus group discussions. We highlighted things about the species in yellow, and we highlighted things about human well-being responses, so the things in blue. And we use these qualitative data to build a quantitative database. So for these 2 species, for example, we've got their traits and we've got the kind of well-being benefits on the edge. And we standardized those and we kind of coded the benefits described by people into our well-being pizza. So here we've got our emotional and our spiritual well-being benefits there. And we kind of use this database to show all the different ways in which people described different species behaviors, colors, sounds, smells, textures in relation to their well-being. We had a huge diversity of things people noticed. And using all of that really rich data, we designed a new scale that could capture directly the health and well-being benefits of biodiversity. A lot of the scales we have to look at this kind of thing come from the health sector. They may not have anything to do with nature or green space. This scale kind of, helps to get rid of that chicken or the egg problem that we saw in those cross-sectional studies. Scales available online at the website at the bottom. We tested it with over 4,000 people across England and Wales. And we found kind of 88% of people are having positive responses to biodiversity, while only sort of 12% have negative responses. We've also tested it in a few woodlands in England, and that's just in review at the moment, but we're finding something similar. And we found during testing that if people had, trouble with their hearing or with their sight or smell, they were scoring lower on that scale. That's kind of self-explanatory, but it's nice to see that the scale works. And this kind of has implications for, when we're starting to think about inclusivity in nature and health. So kind of designing spaces that are appropriate for everyone, for example, including those with, say, sensory impairments. But we also know biodiversity is dynamic across the seasons, and this is something that isn't really looked at in nature and health. So in our workshops that we ran, we actually did them across the seasons. And we kind of, when we were looking at the language people used over time, we saw differences in sort of different species or different traits people noticed. So for instance, smells like damp change with the seasons, obviously, but as a result of different ecological processes like decomposition. So that was quite nice to see as well. But in this analysis of 140 hours of ordinary people's language, it was really insightful. And, people are using their own reference points when they're talking about biodiversity. They're using personal experiences, social norms, stories, maybe from childhood. So we've got, someone describing the texture of a tawny owl as a seeded bloomer or a loaf of bread. We've got the fly agaric mushroom in relation to kind of fairy tales or references to characters from Super Mario. So when we're talking to people about biodiversity, so in education or in outreach, we need to start with the ways people think about biodiversity themselves, what their lived experience of that is. And one of my professors, Rob Fish, tried to kind of categorize these different ways into these 12 domains. There's a ton of evidence showing us how biodiversity is related to our health and well-being now. What does it mean in practice? So the public is convinced already of the benefits of the outdoors, nice to see, from all different sectors of society. It's a pretty unanimous feeling amongst people. Again, we're still talking about generic concepts of nature rather than biodiversity specifically. Policymakers are also already convinced at national, international level. Everyone's saying we should all have equal access to green space, live near a green space. In the UK, we're now saying we should all be within 15 minutes of a green space. Again, we're not talking about biodiversity in the same way. Perhaps the evidence isn't quite translated well enough yet, and maybe we don't have enough mechanistic detail which we need to design the proper policies. In a project that I've just finished with the Woodland Trust, which is a charity working on forests in England, we had a look at forest biodiversity. So we modelled the distribution of all the species that people described in the database I showed earlier. And we overlaid those models to create a map of where you can find woodlands that have, say, a higher potential to deliver human well-being benefits. We did that for all the seasons and for both positive as well as negative types of well-being. Just drawing your attention, for example, to the richness of spring compared with winter when it comes to the potential for species that can deliver well-being. We know this area in the UK, so the southeast, has a lot of broadleaf and ancient woodland, which we also recorded to have the highest richness of species traits that were important for well-being. We look at where those woodlands were in comparison to deprivation measures. So this is the government's, UK government's measure of deprivation on the left. We found that woodlands in deprived areas tended to have much lower potential to deliver well-being. And this kind of raises important questions about equal access to health-promoting environmental landscapes. If you don't live near a green space or a woodland, you can go find an outdoor place to go do your own kind of nature-based health intervention. In some parts of the UK, we've got doctors prescribing activities that take place in natural environments with the aim to improve different aspects of our health. Therapeutic gardening, community allotments, wild swimming, outdoor exercise. We've got a lot going on right now. Lots of trials being run. This report came out quite recently. They evaluated 8,000 participants in nature-based prescribing schemes. And this one participant literally said, it works better than medication for me. It works better than cognitive behavioral therapy. And the authors showed that on average, taking part in these schemes was half the cost of the equivalent medication. Lots of people are caveating that, green prescriptions should be used in tandem with the appropriate medication because neither has a, high success rate. This was a report commissioned by the UK government to understand these linkages a bit better. You can see it's got a long way to go still. There's a lot of demand, but sort of finding out what works for whom and in what circumstances needs to be refined a little. We've got, some people taking it into their own hands. So this was a study, got 42 households in Northern England to add some potted plants to their front gardens. Really nice randomized control trial. They found that more biodiverse front gardens led to reduced self-reported stress, as well as reduced blood cortisol. This was a really small sample of 42, but a very nice example of how nature-based interventions can be used to benefit people as well as biodiversity. The evidence that we use in planning to design those front gardens is still really variable. One of my colleagues showed that depending on which guidance you use when you're designing tree planting in a city, you could end up with a city that's really allergenic. This is a map of Montreal, and each map uses a different data source about which trees have different levels of allergenicity. You've got one source that says these specific trees are fine, and another saying that the exact same trees are not fine. So that's another caveat when we're thinking about nature-based solutions. And of course, no matter how much biodiversity exists, people could always perceive barriers to using it. This is a really nice infographic that kind of summarized that. Feelings of, it's not safe, it doesn't have the appropriate facilities, it's inaccessible for whatever reason. And, changing cultures of use takes a lot of time. Getting people to change their habits is hard. One solution, to ensuring biodiverse green spaces are co-designed or co-produced with people to those that live near them and use them, can help really give people what they really need. And a lot of the evidence I've showed you so far is from Western countries. We know that across the world, people's relationships with biodiversity are very different. So are the different species or traits that are important for health and well-being. This is a diagram from the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, showing how different people relate to biodiversity across the world in different ways. And most of that evidence we have is geographically biased. So some colleagues mapped where you can find evidence. This is just linking urban green space to mental health as one example. A lot more has been done since this map was published, but you can see that you can see those biases nicely on the map. So you've got far less coming from countries that are kind of less economically developed, and those are places where you might have higher rates of urbanization or population growth, or importantly, biodiversity loss as well. I don't know if I've got time to go through this, so I might skip. I'm going to skip to my final slide. Sorry, give me a second. It's going to be really annoying for people watching online. So yeah, kind of just to conclude, it was a kind of whistle-stop tour of how biodiversity benefits our health. We need to acknowledge different contexts, what species, what traits, what time of year, whereabouts, for who. Biodiversity could be beneficial for health and well-being. And to understand all that, we need to talk to psychologists, geography, medicine, social science, humanities, ecologists. Everyone needs to be thinking about this in different ways. You need to use different methods to get at the underpinnings, mechanisms, different approaches. We still don't really have enough evidence as it stands. It's clear that health policies need to include nature, which we can have co-benefits for conservation as well. And things are starting to move in the right direction, particularly when we're thinking about cost savings for the health system. It's accelerating nature-based social prescribing, particularly in the UK. In the global extinction crisis, we not only should we be thinking about conservation for public health, but the same could be true the other way around, and conservation can use the health evidence to help persuade everyday people, policymakers, practitioners of the role of biodiversity for everyone. So that's it. Yeah, thanks a lot to our supervisors, collaborators and funders, as well as all of our participants who gave their time to this work generously. So yeah, thank you for listening, and happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jessica, for your wonderful sharing. So you draw the conclusion saying that healthy environment, healthy people. I think that is the key message for all of us. And let's see if we have some quick questions from the floor. Oh, yeah, please come over.
Hi, this is Alice. Can you hear me?
Yeah, come over so that they can see you.
Thank you. Thank you for your sharing. I love birds. So I really understand the post-pandemic that really happens, that we found to have more sparrow on the street in post-pandemic. So in fact, more Hong Kong people are enjoying the view. I also want to comment, in Hong Kong, some of the hospital in the lobby, they actually have some pond of fish. So they want to engage the kids when they're cranky. At least they can, while waiting for the prescription fill, they can look at the fish. Or maybe when we go to restaurant, we look at the tank and those fish not yet get cooked, so we can still see it fishing. But my question is, because in nursing, we want to support those vulnerable populations. So we do deal with those who are deaf, and also cannot see well, impaired skin, impaired sight. So I'm intrigued in using the tool for the BioWell scale, because it does measure on colors and sounds. So when we are using that to measure on those vulnerable population with deaf or visually impaired, how should we adapt to this? So I want to see if you can give me more insight, please.
Great.
So the scale is, we've got a website for it if you wanted to have a look at it. There's a couple of papers trying to get breaking down how it works. It's quite long. There are different questions in there, and you can actually break it up into the questions that are important for what it is you want to look at. You could, for example, pick some of the questions that are on sound specifically or colours specifically, depending on which populations you're working with. We're interested in people who do want to, adapt the scale for their own research. So, I mean, yeah, do get in contact with me if you need some help thinking about that in any more detail. But yeah, really interesting what you're saying as well about, how we can think about this in practice and getting it actually helping getting that evidence together so that we can, think about, say, hospital design or things like that as well. So yeah, don't know if that answers your question. Maybe it does, kind of.
We'll all try to figure out the right dose, but this is good exposure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone, speakers and participants online and on site. I'm cautious of the time. I think this is just the beginning of our dialogue, and let's keep on our communication and discussion. And of course, we want more partnership. Okay, great. Have a nice day, everyone. Cheers. Bye. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Jessica. Cheers. Bye.